Naschy.
Paul Naschy, born in Madrid and christened Jacinto Molina Alvarez, was an actor, writer, and director. Often referred to as the Spanish Lon Chaney, Naschy played nearly every classic horror icon in some form or another, but he is best known for his character Waldemar Daninsky, the tormented werewolf, whom he played in no less than a dozen films. However, Naschy wasn't merely an actor and a filmmaker. He was a kind of emissary for the horror genre itself. There is a certain innocence and childlike sense of wonder in his fantasy horror films, even when they're filled with booze and blood. His most pivotal moment occurred when he was just 8 years old and saw the poster for the new movie playing at the local cinema. It was Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. He took one look at that poster and knew he had to see it. But no matter how much he begged his mother, she refused to take such a young child to a horror film. So he went to the theater every day for a week, begging to see the film, until a kindly usher finally had the good sense to admit defeat. That experience launched what was to be a lifelong love affair with fantasy horror cinema. When watching the Universal horror films, children are more inclined to identify with the monster than to be afraid of them, and little Jacinto Molina was no exception, instantly becoming obsessed with the tragic hero, Lawrence Talbot, the Wolfman. In his youth, Naschy was a natural athlete. After an injury ended his career as a soccer player, he became a champion weightlifter, which he later gave up to pursue his artistic inclinations, writing pulp novels and screenplays. Molina seems to have been destined to star in what would be the first Spanish horror film, The Mark of the Werewolf, in 1967. Scripted by Molina himself, it was a big-budget affair, shot on 70mm widescreen, and slated to star none other than the Wolfman himself, Lon Chaney Jr. However, at the last minute, Chaney dropped out of the project, possibly due to his worsening alcoholism, and the producers scrambled to find a replacement. They took one look at the screenwriter with the burly weightlifter's physique, and they knew that they had their werewolf. Censorship in Franco Spain was pretty relaxed for a military dictatorship. Stories about vampires, werewolves, and vengeful spirits were considered harmless fantasy. The only stipulation that the censors made was that the films couldn't take place in Spain. So the locale was moved to Germany, and since cases of lycanthropy could only conceivably occur in non-Spaniards, the werewolf was given a Polish name, Waldemar Daninsky. It would be a role Naschy would reprise in 11 more films. Since his given name was considered too ethnic for the international market, Molina was given a half an hour to choose a more marketable stage name. Combining the name of the then current Pope with the last name of a buddy from his weightlifting days, he settled on Paul Naschy. Mark of the Werewolf is a wild, playful, deliberately outrageous film that never takes itself too seriously. Never before had werewolf maulings been depicted with such savagery. The Mark of the Werewolf was every bit the success it deserved to be, and it put Spain on the map as a new player in the international horror movie scene. It also defined Naschy's wild approach to the genre, often pitting his werewolf against other creatures of the night. The Daninsky movies are equal parts Universal monster movie, hammer horror film, and sexy Spanish exploitation flick. A strange but often potent formula that makes for some truly memorable viewing experiences. Assignment Terror, made in 1970, was Spain's answer to the Universal monster rallies, like House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, throwing together a vampire, the Frankenstein monster, the mummy, and the werewolf Waldemar Daninsky. Naschy once again undertook the writing duties, concocting a kooky, campy plot with echoes of Plan 9 from Outer Space, involving aliens, led by a slumming Michael Rennie of The Day the Earth Stood Still fame, who use a traveling circus as cover for a plot to conquer the Earth using the monsters who so terrify the human race. Beset by production problems, such as a rapidly diminishing budget, and allegedly up to 3 different directors, Naschy was forced to gut his own script, which originally had included at least one more monster, a golem, and flying saucers, although one wonders why they couldn't just dangle a burning hubcap from a fishing line. Though it fails to rise to the level of its own insane premise, Assignment Terror is enjoyable nonsense for Euro horror fans in an undemanding mood. Naschy's next effort was La Noche de Walpurgis, also known as The Werewolf vs. the Vampire Woman. Released in 1971, it would mark Naschy's first collaboration with Argentinian art house director Leon Klimovsky, a relationship that would spawn many more notable horror films. A coroner is called to autopsy the body of a man who, according to the local caretaker of the morgue, was reputed to be a werewolf. As he removes the silver bullets from the corpse's heart, the doctor condescendingly dismisses such provincial beliefs as superstitious claptrap, until, of course, the resurrected Valdemar drops a hairy, clawed hand on the man's shoulder. Valdemar tears the men to bloody ribbons and escapes into the night. Graduate students Elvira and her friend Genevieve arrive in town looking for the burial site of Countess Vandessa, which is said to contain a silver dagger in the form of a cross. They meet Valdemar and he joins their search, believing that the cross might be his only hope for eternal peace. As Genevieve pulls the cross dagger from Vandessa's desiccated remains, she cuts herself and blood spatters onto the skeleton's open mouth. Rising from her grave, Vandessa seduces and vampirizes Genevieve, and soon Valdemar finds himself struggling to not only protect Elvira from the bloodsuckers, but from himself as the full moon fast approaches. La Noche de Walpurgis represents everything that is special about Spanish horror cinema. At turns silly and surreal, eerie and sexy, gory and romantic, it combines the old-fashioned thrills of Universal monster movies, the garish bloodletting and eroticism of Hammer horror, and the poetry of Jean Cocteau to create something altogether unique. It's filled with sublime, breathtaking moments. After tearing a woman's throat out, Valdemar sets her body down on the ground, gently. A patch of naked soil seems to pulsate, as if breathing, and a hand emerges. Vandessa appears in the distance, out of focus, and, in an amazing, simple effect, seems to literally melt into the shadows. In a surreal dream sequence, Vandessa and the vampirized Genevieve drift into Elvira's room and stab her in the neck, filling a golden goblet with her blood. Vandessa drinks first, being the master vampire, and then she passes the goblet to Genevieve, who greedily quaffs the remainder. Then, in a lusty, decadent gesture, Genevieve tosses the goblet aside and wipes her mouth with the back of her hand. In celebration, the vampire women hold hands and spin like little girls, vanishing into the night. It's an eerie, fascinating moment. Vandessa and her sapphic bride inhabit an eerie yet sensual half-light world located someplace between dream and nightmare. Although both Naschy and Klimovsky would go on to make technically better movies, there is an undeniable, irresistible magic to La Noche de Walpurgis that make it a fan favorite. A certifiable hit at home and abroad, it was the film that really set the Spanish horror boom in motion. Sadly, the follow-up to the artistic and financial triumph that was La Noche de Walpurgis was 1972's The Fury of the Wolfman, a real mess that recycles footage from Marca of the Werewolf and has a similarly madcap plot. Only this time it all ends up a confusing, incoherent mess. Rumor has it that the director was a drunk who turned script revisions over to his 14-year-old nephew. Well, I guess that explains the man-eating plant. Skip this one, as it's for Naschy completists only. Made the same year, with far better results, was Dr. Jekyll and the Werewolf. Of all the Daninsky films, a series that has Naschy's werewolf fighting vampires, mummies, and even the Yeti, it has the most clever, toss monsters into a blender and see what comes out plot of them all. Valdemar travels to modern-day London to find the grandson of Dr. Henry Jekyll in the hopes that he can find a cure for his lycanthropy. Jekyll tries to suppress Valdemar's transformation by injecting him with his grandfather's hide serum, then applying the antidote to turn him human again. Unfortunately, Jekyll's assistant Sandra, named after one of the villains in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, isn't playing with the full deck herself and sabotages the experiment with tragic results. It's all done with a sense of chaotic fun, self-aware without descending into self-parody. Like the Hammer films that inspired them, these films have the good sense to play it straight, no matter how absurd the goings-on. And, although he doesn't get much screen time, Naschy's Hyde is quite fun to watch. A murderous, sadistic lech who prowls London's notorious red light district like a modern-day Jack the Ripper. In what would prove to be his most prolific year, Naschy starred in no less than 4 Euroshockers in 1973. Directed by Javier Aguirre and scripted by Naschy, Hunchback of the Morgue is a truly nasty piece of work, a mean-spirited grand guignol of the highest order, and one of Naschy's best films. Essentially a Frankenstein movie told from the point of view of the mad scientist's, often hunchbacked assistant, the type of character Dwight Fry would play in the old Universal classics. Set somewhere in the Bavarian Alps, but shot in Spain, the story concerns a mentally retarded hunchback named Gotho, who works in the morgue of the local medical college. Poor Gotho's got it rough. Children pelt him with stones, the medical students bully him, and the only person who shows him any kindness, a childhood friend named Ilsa, is dying from a terminal illness. When Ilsa's body ends up in the morgue and he sees the sadistic medical students about to mutilate her body, Gotho finally snaps and makes short work of them with a hatchet. He escapes with the corpse and hides in the catacombs beneath the ruins of a medieval abbey. Dr. Orla, a Frankensteinian scientist bent on creating life artificially, has his funds cut by the college but vows to continue his experiments. He happens upon a stroke of luck when Gotho, who trusts him because he tried to save Ilsa, comes to him for help. Orla sets up shop in the catacombs and uses Gotho to procure corpses for his experiments. Orla's experiments seem more like alchemy than traditional science, and soon he's growing a homunculus, a one-celled organism that has the potential to become humanoid. Soon, Orla is sending Gotho out on midnight runs for corpses and, inevitably, live bodies to feed the creature. Hunchback is chock-a-block with gruesome, ghoulish moments. Gotho returns to Ilsa's body to discover it being devoured by rats. When he discovers that 3 of Orla's lackeys have disposed of Ilsa's putrefying remains in the acid bath, Gotho goes berserk, killing 2 of them and tossing acid into the face of the 3rd. In a particularly ghoulish later scene, the man is seen mindlessly wandering the catacombs with his murdered comrade lashed to his back with rope, his doleful moans echoing through the tunnels. Although he's no Charles Laughton, Naschy gives one of his best performances here, endowing Gotho with an endearing innocence one moment and savage bloodlust the next. Although he is undoubtedly a murderer, the poor, beleaguered hunchback never comes across as evil. If you were Gotho, you'd be carrying severed heads around in plastic bags too. And when the end titles roll, you can't help but be reminded, he did it all for love. Also directed by Javier Aguirre that year, Count Dracula's Great Love tries its level best to be the Spanish horror sexploitation equivalent of the Hammer Dracula films. But, unfortunately, it's an incoherent mess. Evidently production problems abounded, and Naschy lacks Christopher Lee's commanding presence. However, it still has some wonderfully surreal moments that make it passable viewing. Teaming once again with Leon Klimovsky, Horror Rises from the Tomb is Naschy's take on Mario Bava's classic Black Sunday, but with the gender roles reversed. Naschy stars as the warlock Alaric de Marnac, and Helga Line plays his equally depraved companion, Mabille. After issuing the requisite promise to avenge himself on his killer's descendants, Alaric is beheaded, and his severed head buried separately from his corpse. Centuries later, the pair are resurrected to rain all kinds of nastiness down on those descendants, devouring the hearts of their victims. Horror Rises from the Tomb has some genuinely unsettling moments. Held at bay by a sacred talisman, Alaric resurrects his victims as zombies and sends them to subdue the heroes. White-eyed and bloody, they generate a genuine sense of dread when they come shuffling into the house. Also, by this time, Naschy's acting had improved significantly. He has an absolutely grand time gloating over his victims and chewing up the scenery. 1975's The Mummy's Revenge has Naschy teaming up again with director Carlos Orid for another stab at the Universal Monsters stable. This time, Naschy has another dual role as both the titular mummy, the sadistic Amenhotep, and the loyal pagan Egyptian priest who unleashes him upon Victorian England. The priest abducts virgins for blood sacrifices to resurrect Amenhotep's favorite concubine and render them both immortal. Unlike any mummy film before it, this one is jam-packed with gore and a surprisingly high body count. Amenhotep has a particular fondness for crushing people's skulls, especially when they're facing the camera. In a gleefully gruesome scene, the mummy has a retinue of virgins laid out on stone tablets for his evaluation. As he goes down the line, he smushes the heads of each one he deems unfit for sacrifice, like they were cherry-filled pastries. Although it never quite delivers on its potential, The Mummy's Revenge makes the most of its modest budget and, despite some pacing issues, is still a really fun entry in Naschy's filmography. The Werewolf and the Yeti, also released in 1975, recasts Valdemar as a kind of pulp hero, an international adventurer and explorer who joins an expedition into the Himalayas to find the legendary Yeti, only to find himself kidnapped by a pair of cannibal witches who turn him into a werewolf, but not before they've made him their sex slave. There are Mongol bandits, gun battles, sword fights, and the climactic, if somewhat disappointing, rumble with the Yeti. This one really cranks the crazy up a notch or two and moves at a swift pace, like some crazy candy-colored Republic movie serial on a heavy dose of the brown acid from Woodstock. Naturally, it's a fan favorite, and technically, still banned in England. El Caminante, or The Traveler as it's known in English, was released in 1979. Here, Naschy is playing the devil himself, but in a kind of episodic art house road movie rather than a proper horror film. A wandering Satan who has decided to visit the earth in human form to gain first-hand knowledge of the human race he has worked so tirelessly to undermine. He's also there to party. He's always tempting and corrupting people and spends much of his time seducing married women. Naschy's performance here may be his finest. He plays Satan as a remorseless sociopath who constantly takes advantage of people, even his supposed friends, whenever it suits his needs or even just his fancy, never accepting responsibility when his actions blow up in his face. In the film's most striking moment, Satan is crucified, facing a statue of Christ, whom he curses for having given his life for such an ungrateful and unworthy creature as man. It's probably Naschy's best performance as an actor, and one can see why it was his personal favorite in his vast filmography. Combining horror elements with bawdy Chaucerian humor and packed with nudity, sex, and violence, it's the perfect distillation of Naschy's dark, bitter, cynical side, something he would explore more in his later films as he became increasingly disillusioned with the Spanish film industry. The cynicism in El Caminante isn't the kind that revels in itself, though. It's the reluctant cynicism of the former idealist whose naivete has been replaced with bitter disappointment. Financially, times were getting tough for Naschy, and getting films made increasingly more difficult. So he turned for financing to a country where he'd long had a popular following, Japan. and it is there where he made his next entry in the Waldemar Daninsky cycle. El Retorno del Hombre Lobo, also known as Night of the Werewolf, made in 1981, marked his triumphant return to the gothic horror genre that had launched his career. Directed by Naschy himself, it's easily the glossiest and best looking of the Daninsky films. It just oozes gothic atmosphere and revels in its Halloween spook show aesthetics. Hammer's Dracula had risen from the grave for the last time in the 1970s, but Waldemar Daninsky still had considerable bite left in him in the early 80s. Loaded with lavish costumes, heaving bosoms, spooky castles, and flying coffins, Night of the Werewolf is refreshingly old-fashioned for an 80s horror film. The werewolf makeup, done in such a way as to incorporate Naschy's beard, is easily the best in the series. With great makeup effects, gothic sets, atmospheric cinematography, and swift pacing, it's probably Naschy's most accessible movie for the uninitiated. On a personal level, it represented a triumph of his vision, one that he had been trying to perfect for 14 years. Naschy said of the film, El Retorno del Hombre Lobo contains all the coordinates of my own life, fitting together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The claustrophobic castle, the gothic tombs, the ill-fated love affair, the menace of the undead, the ostracism of someone who is despised for being different, and the all-pervading shadow of death. The Beast and the Magic Sword, released in 1983, is another Japanese co-production and the 10th entry in the Waldemar Daninsky series. It's an entertaining cross-pollination of the Chambara, the Japanese samurai movie, and gothic Euro horror sexploitation. The film opens in medieval Europe, with Irenaeus Daninsky pissing off a witch who promptly places the curse of the werewolf upon him and all of his descendants. Fast forward to the 16th century, where Waldemar travels to feudal Japan in search of a doctor named Kyan in hopes that he can remove the curse. Taking up the directing reins again, Naschy does a great job of blending such seemingly different genres by taking a swords and sorcery approach to the material. In Japan at that time, even low-budget productions could look pretty slick because they reused the same sets and costumes as their bigger productions. Evidently, the magic sword was made out of actual silver. In Japan, when you ask for a silver sword, you get a silver sword. And the scene in which Waldemar tangles with a tiger clearly features a real tiger. The werewolf makeup has a distinctly Japanese look to it. The brow is enlarged and furrowed, and the nose has a pronounced indentation, creating an Oni-like visage. Given the commercial and artistic success of The Beast and the Magic Sword, Naschy had plans to make more films in Japan, but those were dashed when the Yakuza approached him to smuggle guns into the country. Naturally, you don't say no to the Yakuza, so he agreed to the deal and promptly left the country, never to return. A truly sad turn of events, given that Naschy's Japanese co-productions are widely regarded by fans as his finest, and who knows what other horror classics he would have made there. Howl of the Devil, released in 1987, is Naschy's most painfully personal film, as though he were exposing his broken heart to the viewer in a cinematic purging ritual. Feeling abandoned and unappreciated by the Spanish film industry, middle-aged and having just survived a heart attack, he threw everything he had into this sad, strange little horror film. I can best describe it as a horror version of the Spanish classic, Spirit of the Beehive, a film that views the emotionally and physically violent world of adults from a child's point of view. Naschy's main role is as the mean, surly Hector, an embittered failed actor who has always lived in his more famous brother's shadow, a Spanish Lon Chaney type who died some years prior and left him with his fortune and his son, Adrian. Hector has an appetite for prostitutes, with whom he plays strange sex games when he's not berating his nephew, played by Naschy's own son, Sergio Molina, and sexually harassing the maid, Carmen, played by the always exquisite-looking Caroline Munro. Meanwhile, there's an 80s-style slasher on the loose. There's little doubt in my mind that Howl of the Devil inspired, at least in some part, Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, specifically in the way in which it jumps between the external world of adults and the internal world of a child who is a victim of their surroundings. While Uncle Hector is banging prostitutes and the local priest is conspiring with the local drunk to get Carmen to be his lover, little Adrian lives in a world of his own where he receives periodic visits from his favorite movie monster characters. Naschy knew, as all grown-up monster kids know, that children are much more likely to identify with monsters than to be afraid of them. On the one hand, it's an obvious playground for its writer-director-star, who gives himself the opportunity to play Rasputin, the Frankenstein monster, Mr. Hyde, the Phantom of the Opera, Bluebeard, Quasimodo, Fu Manchu, and even the devil himself, all in the same film. There's a gleeful nastiness in the murders. The killer doesn't merely slash his victims' throats, he saws on them with his blade. But there is a sad, even mournful tone to Howl of the Devil, and a real tenderness in the scenes between Adrian and his beloved monsters whom he relies on for love and support. Naschy wasn't happy with the final product, and there's no denying that Howl of the Devil is a flawed film. But it's a strange, sad little horror movie, and I've always had a thing for strange, sad little horror movies. Jacinto Molina Alvarez, better known to the worldwide horror fandom as Paul Naschy, passed away in 2009 at the age of 75. He leaves behind him an enduring legacy of horror films. At their worst, Paul Naschy movies can be flatly shot, made fast and on the cheap, and clumsily staged. But his good movies beat out his bad ones by a significant margin. And when they are at their best, his movies can be utterly captivating, sometimes even sublime. Once nearly impossible to find in the US, his films are now getting the critical reappraisal they so richly deserve due to their easy accessibility on DVD, Blu-ray, and various streaming services. If you're a serious fan of fantasy horror, you owe it to yourself to explore his filmography. There are some real gems in there. When asked how he would like to be remembered, he said, "I would write that Paul Naschy had at least done his best, and that he cared about what he was doing. I was capable of mistakes, to do it well or to do it poorly. But what I can assure you is that I did it with feeling and affection. I love the fantastic cinema."